The Democracy Forum brings you another not-to-be-missed webinar, Reclaiming Democracy, South Asia's New Surge. Throughout South Asia, public pressure is intensifying as citizens express growing dissatisfaction with established political systems. From Bangladesh to Nepal and Sri Lanka, a wave of youth-led movements is challenging the status quo. This surge in democratic energy is driven by increased demands for accountability, transparency and change. What sparked the central involvement of young people in these movements? How have the catalysts for mobilization varied from country to country? And what obstacles stand in the way of translating protest into lasting reform? To explore South Asia's new surge towards reclaiming democracy, join our live debate and share your questions and insights with our expert panel.
Welcome. I'm Humphrey Hawksley, and this is the Democracy Forum debate, where twice a month we discuss and argue issues often overlooked by the mainstream media and commentary, particularly in the West. Today, reclaiming democracy, South Asia's new surge. What exactly is this thing we call democracy? Bangladesh, Nepal, Sri Lanka have all recently been shaken and swayed by it. And what is the cockroach junta party in India? And how come Sri Lanka's ruling party has its roots in an insurgent and outlawed Marxist movement? To debate all this, we have a superb Democracy Forum panel: Prateep Singh, Sohila Nazneen, Niranjan Sahul. Our Democracy Forum chair, Barry Gardiner, a long-standing member of Britain's House of Commons, will sum up for us at the end. But before any of that, I have the privilege to ask the Democracy Forum president, Lord Charles Bruce, to lay out the background and the canvas of our discussion. Lord Bruce, the floor is yours.
Good afternoon and welcome to our webinar, which examines the rise of alternative political parties and the increasingly strident participation of youth movements in South Asia. I'm grateful to the team at TDF for highlighting this issue and arranging for such a distinguished panel of experts to share their insights and perspectives with us today. I look forward to hearing their contributions and to the discussion that will follow under the moderation of Humphrey Hawksley. In New Delhi on Saturday, a noisy crowd of protesters gathered to celebrate the birth of a brand new political movement, the Cockroach Junta Party, or CJP, founded only 3 weeks ago as a satirical response to the derogatory comments of the Chief Justice, who referred to India's unemployed youth as cockroaches and parasites. Under the charismatic leadership of a postgraduate student, Abhijit Dip, membership of the CJP has surged to over 1 million, with a further 20 million followers on Instagram. Exposing the BJP government's failure to address the economic marginalization of young people, Dip has launched a petition presenting Mr. Modi with an ultimatum, either to sack his Education Secretary Dharmendra Pradhan and implement urgent reforms to the inefficient public examination system, or face countrywide protests. As Dip reflected at the weekend, BJP should move away from Hindu nationalist politics and focus on youth issues. The sudden appearance of a viral youth protest movement should have come as no surprise to India's political establishment. The group's rise echoes a trend across South Asia of youth movements born out of social media playing a central role in anti-government protests, writes the Washington Post. And there is plenty of evidence to demonstrate how political initiatives can gather momentum and thereafter spread swiftly into the mainstream, with profound implications in Sri Lanka in 2022, in Bangladesh in 2024, and in Nepal in 2025, where political movements strongly represented by disaffected students and young people precipitated the physical overthrow and flight of elected leaders. When taken together, such spontaneous acts portray a similar response to the democratic backsliding which has become increasingly prevalent in South Asian countries over the last decade. In each case, protesters have sought accountability from authoritarian and dynastic leaders who had clung to power for years and intensify their response when confronted with brutal repression. Furthermore, politicians pursuing populist agendas have failed to implement their promises, thereby leading to major economic inequalities, corruption, and a desire for systemic change. As The Economist warns, Narendra Modi is not the first to use his power over institutions to tilt elections in his favor, but he is perhaps the most ruthless in doing so since Indira Gandhi. Well, thank you very much for deciding to watch our webinar today, and if you have any comments or questions, please pass them to the panel through the chair.
Thank you, Lord Charles Bruce. Disaffected students, young people precipitated the physical overthrow and the flight of elected leaders. That's some situation. Let us begin with our first panelist. Let us begin with youth itself. Prateep Singh, Program Officer, Democracy of Youth at Interpeace, a global organization with a vision to resolve conflicts without violence. Can democracy do that? He's also worked with the United Nations Development Programme. He holds a master's degree in development studies from the Geneva Graduate Institute, and he's an advocate for child and youth rights. So Prateep Singh, enlighten us. South Asia's new democratic surge. What exactly is going on?
Thank you so much. Let me begin by thanking you for having me here, as I've been working for the past few months in studying and really engaging with young people from around the world, but especially from South Asia, in understanding really what the Gen Z movement has been. Just to say that the conception of these series of movements really happened with the trend of democratic backsliding. And this is something that we see in global debates on democracy today, that the trend of democratic backsliding has been a global factor, in fact, accompanied by really the democratic delivery deficit and the slide of most democracies towards authoritarianism. However, emerging right from South Asia in the past 2-3 years, there has been a significant change, primarily led by young people. And these movements, primarily led by young people, have been starting really having the foundations in South Asia. We saw them in Sri Lanka, where they took the name of Aragalya movement, wherein young people increasingly came to the streets to protest against the government, which ultimately led to the replacement of the government in Sri Lanka, a turn towards a more democratically elected government. In Bangladesh, we saw them as the July Uprising, wherein thousands of young people stormed the streets in Dhaka and elsewhere in the country as well, just to make sure and express their frustrations with the current government, which ultimately also led to a change in the government in Bangladesh. And in Nepal, where the movement finally got the global name that we know today, the name of Gen Z movement, where it really got the foundations and was primarily led by young people as actors of change. And now, of course, the Gen Z movement has been a global factor with its presence in Indonesia and across, Africa and Tanzania, Madagascar, Kenya, also in wider parts of Southeast Asia, including Philippines and Indonesia, and beyond and beyond. And we see these primarily young people as actors and coming together under common grievances. If we talk to these young people and we really understand what their grievances has been, it has ranged from corruption to this feeling of electoral capture by a group of elites, and the elites as in the political elites. They're frustrated with institutional failures. There have been frustrations with the way the economies have been dealt with in unemployment. But almost in all of these places, a unilateral trigger has been the state repression. As we see, in the lifetime of most of these movements, there have been grievances, as I described, which have been common. But in most cases, the immediate trigger that has led to the governments being replaced has been repression and undue repression from the police forces of the states in most of these countries. And therefore, I call these movements really movements to reclaim democracy, led by young people, to gain back something that they had envisioned as a healthy democracy against these authoritarian governments or these governments where democratic backsliding has been a factor. And it has been a remarkable moment so far, at least. It helps paint youth movements, particularly starting from South Asia, but also beyond, in a new light. We saw the Arab Springs as the last sort of imagination of youth movements, and which widely led to the conclusion that youth movements do not work and youth movements are ultimately a failure. However, with the recent rise of the Gen Z movements, primarily led by young people, there has been a wider understanding that young people have been frustrated with democratic backsliding. They're frustrated with a number of ways that their own countries and laws are being dealt with. They want a larger say in the affairs of the government and the democratically elected leaders that they put in power, but also that they want to reclaim their institutions from the trends of democratic backsliding, corruption, elite capture, unemployment, and economic grievances. And therefore, I also see this movement as unique in certain ways, primarily because of a few factors. The first one of them being the digital ways of convening. These movements have almost ubiquitously have acquired a unique way of convening digitally, trying to mobilize new way of digitalizing. If I go in particular, there's this sort of popular understanding that the interim government that was elected in Nepal was primarily elected through a new digital method, Discord, right? So there's a lot of mobilization that has happened around these movements has also been primarily digital. And therefore, this also helps us look at social movements led by young people being interpreted, mobilized, and led through digital means of organizing. Second has been very prominently is that young people have also been political actors, but importantly, mediators between governments that have been in power, youth groups which have been led by young people themselves. And there's a distinct group of young people that emerge in all of these movements that try to mediate between the young people who've been protesting and who've been on the streets with the governments. In most of these cases, these mediation attempts have failed, and therefore the states have resorted to violence, and that violence has gotten immense consequences for these movements. As a response for this violence, what happens is that young people feel frustrated and angry and take over and sort of push for taking over the government rather violently. And this has again been a very common factor. And a third very common factor has been the leaderlessness of these movements. Almost ubiquitously again, one thing that the Gen Z movements and young people have prided themselves on has been really the leaderlessness that they've been able to maintain, which is also symbolic of how frustrated young people have been with traditional elite leaders that have been a part of these countries. And I can speak for Bangladesh and Nepal here, having talked to young people from these countries, is that there was a frustration. And therefore, in the government that followed, the interim government that was put in place was really led by people or politicians who were really apolitical, public figures. In Nepal, we saw the Chief Justice, who also ultimately became the first woman Prime Minister of Nepal, who had a rather apolitical position. Sushila Karki was selected rather as the interim leader and was tasked with leading the country through peaceful elections. I had the chance to visit Nepal and connect with some of these leaders back in December last year. During a very tense time of ensuring that elections are peaceful, while there were so many new developments in the country within young people and within youth movements. And it was a very, very interesting time. Similarly, in Bangladesh, Mohammed Yunus, who was in Paris, was called to lead an interim government owing to his apolitical image and the image of a clean politician, rather. So this all represents the deep-set frustrations that young people have had with existing elite capture and the leaders that they say, and if I can quote, rotating within parliaments without any prospects for change. And therefore, these common signs really lead us to almost a ubiquitous conceptualization of these Gen Z leaders and capturing them with the diversity of the local needs that they've been having. And over the course of discussions, of course, I'd be very happy to focus more on some of these countries, particularly Nepal, and the way that young people have been mobilizing in these countries.
Pradeep Singh, thank you very much. That was most enlightening. Now, just to make sure we're all on the same page here, Gen Z is aged around 15 to 30, is that right?
Absolutely, and that has been represented in these movements.
And how old are you, if it's not rude me asking?
I'm 23, sir.
You're 23. Okay, so you are right in the heart of the Gen Z movement. And you made a point there that the Arab Spring didn't work but it seems to be working in South Asia. Is that because of the system of government or the cultures in North Africa and the Middle East, or the digital age has changed? Can you put your finger on that a bit?
Absolutely. No, in most of these countries, definitely the frustration was that the promises of democracy did not work. So definitely a setting of democracy did have an impact in the way that young people imagined the ways, or the ends of the movement as such. So the motivation really came, and that's why the stress on reclaiming democracy is that democracies existed in these countries, particularly in South Asia, primarily. Right. And there were promises of democratic delivery, which then was a deficit, which young people were frustrated with. So definitely, if we look at Arab Spring versus what we see in South Asia, it's fundamentally different, given that these movements are being predominantly led by young people in countries that were pre-existingly a democracy.
Okay, that's a very good. I have a question from Ritu Madan here. Is democratic pushback in the region driven more by economic disenfranchisement of the young rather than any real ideological commitment to democracy?
That is very right. Economic disenfranchisement has been a big factor in driving these movements. In Bangladesh, we saw the rising unemployment, and similarly in Nepal, the rising unemployment was a big factor that pushed young people to come to the streets. However, the ultimate trigger that came, rather than coming from an ideological position, it came more from a position of frustration and anger towards the government, particularly when young people were faced with repression. And therefore...
Sorry, which gets me to the next point. What has been delivered has been a symbol of hope, possibly, and a victory against, as you said, the entrenched elites or anything. Is there evidence that the institutions have got an ability to deliver what these people want?
It's a little early to say, because in most of some of these movements, particularly if you look in Africa, are still ongoing. In South Asia, we have a new government in Nepal and a new one in Bangladesh, although there's a lot of criticism around the nature of these governments and whether they will be able to uphold...
How long with the impatience of the Gen Z movement and the digital age, how long have these new governments got?
I think it's hard to judge the patience, but at the same time, and I can say for Nepal that, it's still very formative, because there are clear demands from some of the young people, such as institutionalizing the Gen Z movement through Gen Z councils. And if the government is able to deliver on the demands, then I think it would be right to say that there is a sort of receptiveness from the newly elected governments. However, if these new governments have been elected, still fail to deliver, then there are larger questions about how long these movements can sustain. And again, that's why I say that it's a little too early to say, because it would depend on the sustainability of these movements, given their leaderlessness, given the digital nature of their organization.
It's absolutely fascinating. Stay with us, because we will come back to you. Maybe you will be challenged, but we next go to Dr. Sohaila Nazneen, a senior fellow at the Institute of Development Studies in Britain. She was a faculty member at the Department of International Relations at the University of Dhaka and has worked with a slate of developmental institutions like the United Nations, the MacArthur Foundation, the Gates Foundation, among others. Her speciality is examining resistance to the backlash against gender equity, social justice, and civic space. All of those are elements of a democratic society. Is there a new surge? Is it real, Sohaila Nazneen? Tell us what you know.
Are you asking about South Asia or any country specific?
I'm asking about, tell us what you know about South Asia. The debate is about South Asia.
Okay, so I'll connect to Prateek in terms of the points he was making, but also talk about the variations that exist between the change in regimes that you see in South Asia, right? South Asia got very interesting since 2024. Normally, the discussion is dominated by what's happening between India and Pakistan. But we started looking at smaller countries, right? In a sense that what happened in Sri Lankan elections, but also what happened in terms of the uprising in Bangladesh, and then Nepal followed. Now, the triggers for these changes in terms of the popular youth-led movements that we have seen and that led to regime change obviously is partly about economic disenfranchisement, but it is also about the misgovernance, the corruption, the elite capture of institutions, the failure of delivery that we see in terms of the promises of what development could bring. And a dream about a different kind of system that is more inclusive, that respects your voice and your choices, right? But even though these incidents had triggers, you have to look at, well, how bloody these were. Bangladesh's was probably the most bloodiest, with 1,400 lives lost and 19,000 injured, compared to the other two countries. It's also important to note the role of the army in the case of Bangladesh, but also in other countries that armies restrained themselves. If we are talking about democracy, a lot of the time you do have security forces intervening. I'm not saying there wasn't repression, but in terms of taking over or seeing a coup, we didn't see that. We saw transitions in terms of elections held and electoral transition happening in terms of concerned parties, all of them agreeing to the results of that election. That's the first test of democracy, right? But it's about who came into power. And whether you see new players emerging, or is it the same old, same old? And for the three countries, it's slightly different. For Bangladesh, you see the same, if it is about challenging dynastic rule and having new players, in Bangladesh, it's the Bangladesh Nationalist Party that won a majority, which is a continuity of previous political parties. So the question is, will they rein in their behavior, and how do they behave in terms of the transition? In terms of student-led party, which is NCP, gaining formal seat at the table, they have won 6 seats. They made an alliance with Jamaat-e-Islami, which is the right-wing party. And Jamaat has gained quite a few seats, 68 seats, a huge electoral gain than previously what we have seen. In terms of looking at Sri Lanka, it's a JVP-led coalition, but it has a new partner and there are newer players. In terms of Nepal, obviously it's exciting. It's a new party led by Balan Shah. The established parties had a trouncing in the elections. So you can see in terms of transition and looking at different configurations of power, whether all entrenched elites power was broken, the results are different of the youth-led uprising and regime change. It's also important to think, what would these new governments face, which is what was coming up in your questions. All of these governments will have to deal with economic crisis, particularly given the Gulf War, and it will also have to deal with relations with India. But let's go back to the issue in terms of looking at aspirations and thinking about the dreams that there are, what the youth-led movement held in terms of systemic change and how far systemic changes would hold. For Nepal, it's too soon to tell. The elections have just happened and players have come in terms of how far the structures would shift. In terms of Bangladesh, we can already see certain concerns emerging, particularly around the July Charter. The Charter, which was placed in a referendum, which talks about how do you break the over-centralization of power and executive dominance. And there are certain provisions that were talked about. BNP has already placed reservations on certain things, and which are quite worrying, particularly around judicial independence and independence of constitutional bodies, because it is about systemic change, which the youth demanded, right? In terms of Sri Lanka, again, the picture is mixed, but the government has managed to address economic crisis, and there are some promising facts. Looking at how far the new governments, I mean, I'm talking about formal power structures because it is a reflection of what is going to happen in formal spaces, who is in the room. It is rather disappointing when it comes to women itself and women's representation. Nomination of women candidates in elections were not so great if you look at all 3 countries and how many won. who sits at the table is quite important, given that these are all critical junctures in these countries' histories and that is being discussed and negotiated. Where I see hope is that the youth-led movements and the discourse that they brought in, and also the practice of what Prateek was talking about in terms of leaderless movements, in terms of use of the digital medium for framing discourses and issues. What is exciting to see is issues being debated. It's people not taking it as same old, or anything that's being given. And that is very important for creating democratic norms and practice. Obviously, patience is a key issue in terms of democratic practice takes a particular way of how you debate and what you debate on. And sometimes we do have excesses, but the fact that people are willing to dream differently and to keep on questioning is very important. And I'll stop there.
Thank you very much. Do you share Prateek Singh's Gen Z optimism generally for it, or are you a little bit? Tell me where you stand on that.
As a person, I'm always optimistic. I will talk about it as a Bangladeshi, how we felt, and that will actually answer your question. So before 2024. It felt like we were frozen in a way, right? That you felt hopeless in the sense that autocracy seemed as if it's immovable, that things were not going to shift. And it's not that what you saw unfolding in 2024 didn't have its origins before, because Gen Z generation, as you talk about, it's from 15 to 30. So those who are closer to 30, they have led other movements that we have seen unfold, and state repression being quite strong. And in 2024, initially when it was unfolding, it felt like, well, how long would this go on? And this is around quota, so it's about economic issues. And if that is resolved, things will go back to normal. It's not going to lead to a bigger change, right? And when the repression started, and the repression was severe, right? You had snipers shooting from helicopters, that level, right? And people didn't go back. Students managed to bring people together. And the demands were much larger than just about quota. And that gives you hope that if you can counter that, yes, things are going to be difficult, but things can change.
And so you're in agreement with Prateek then about the comparison to the Arab Spring, that you have a different culture, different systems in South Asia than you had in North Africa and the Middle East, and therefore it might be able to push its way through?
I think it's not just about culture, it's also about what kind of institutions you have in place and what has been the history of it, right? And also the severity of repression, and whether you have armed conflict present, because armed conflict changes the scenario in a very big way. So the transition, if you look at Nepal and Nepal's negotiated transition, which started in after sort of the Maoist revolution.
After the war,
Yes. So that transitional trajectory is important. Bangladesh always had a kind of military intervention, going back to democracy, military intervention, going back to democracy.
And Sri Lanka had a huge civil war for 25 years, didn't it? Yeah.
But at the same time, what are the kinds of state institutions that exist in terms of debating democracy and creating that kind of legacy, right? That's also quite important when you're talking about democratic practice and what people expect. And those have a historical trajectory. So I think that's why you see the results being different.
But it is a reclaim of something that was there before. Can I give you a final question from Mohammed Ismail here? How are young activists bypassing traditional gerontocratic political parties to set their own policy agendas?
Oh, that is an interesting
good question. Huh?
Very good question. Because if you I mean, setting your policy agendas, it depends on where are you setting it, right? Are you setting it in the civic space, or are you setting it in the formal policy space, and who's in the parliament?
Where does it need to be set?
Yes, but what you see, I mean, you see a lot of new faces in the parliament, which is interesting than what you would have seen in terms of the same old, same old. I mean, NCP, the 6 leaders are new leaders, but you also see other leaders that have emerged who may not have won the election, but they have contested. You have the student organizations who talk about policy, are engaging with different issues, and there are spaces for those forums, including think tanks that have emerged that are organized by
we have we have a thing that drives me crazy here in Britain, that everybody says we need to have a conversation about this and we need to have a debate about this, whether it's 30 years discussing a new runway at Heathrow Airport and everything. You haven't got time for this, have you? I mean, in South Asia, you have to show that there are new policies in force. Am I right?
What do you mean by new policies?
The government, these new faces that you say have pushed aside, what did he say, the gerontocratic political parties, pushed to one side. But these new faces have got to show that the government is doing something that's different.
Well, there is a time pressure. So the time pressure, one is about July. What do you take from July Charter, right? There are already contestations around that. And it is with the first session of the parliament that things need to be approved. So the clock is ticking. There are certain things that have already been taken on board and certain things being debated, very hotly debated, because things that are being left out, a lot of people don't agree with, particularly the youth around that. But there is also an economic pressure, right? The interim government managed to sort of bring up our reserves, which was great, and stabilize the economy. Particularly our banking sector was tanking, which was very, very worrying. But because of the money that has been siphoned off by the Awami League regime, but at the same time, the current pressures are different. The inflationary pressure, what Gulf War is doing, where you need to get fertilizer from, the fuel crisis, it's not going to be easy. So yes, BNP has hit the ground running, but it will have to deliver very, very soon. And people are not going to take it kind of like, oh yeah, it's fine, because it is not fine.
This is great. I think I can almost say that you have almost the same amount of optimism as Pradeep Singh, your previous panelist. Thank you very much for that. We are now going to go for a very short break and back with you in a moment. Welcome back. Now we go to our third panelist, Dr. Niranjan Sahu from India's Observer Research Foundation's Governance and Politics Initiative. He's also the South Asia member for the Carnegie Rising Democracies Network. His third book, due out soon, is entitled Exclusion and Insurgencies in India, and his latest co-authored monograph, Funding India's Democracy, will be published soon. All of those are big issues. Niranjan Sahu, give us your thoughts, and particularly what is this democratic storm of cockroaches swooping through Delhi at the moment?
Hi, Humphrey. Thanks for getting me. And this is a real great time to actually talk about GNG movement or protest about India, because when I was invited about this particular issue, 15-20 days back, I was wondering what to actually speak, because practically we haven't actually experienced, Gen Z kind of, uprising like Nepal and Bangladesh had seen. So in a sense, this has actually, this Cockroach Janta Party, CJP, protest we witnessed a couple of days back, has actually given ample of, I would say legroom for me to maneuver, because for practically when Nepal thing happened last year, in India's police circle we used to have a lot of actually debate that it's impossible to have something a kind of Gen Z kind of protest that Nepal has witnessed, or Bangladesh for that matter witnessed, because it's a huge country, very federal, decentralized, and diverse communities, and voters level of polarization is very, very sharp. So it won't be India doesn't really have that sort of conditions to have a Gen Z protest. But then on 14th May, the Chief Justice of India makes this very demonizing kind of casual comment about unemployed youth, categorize them as cockroaches or parasites for the society, and that actually in just matter of 2 days created so much of outrage among not only youth, also entire population. I think even older voters I see were really outraged that if someone of a Chief Justice stature can make this kind of comment, demonizing comment. So that actually led to a kind of fast sort of digital initiative, digital activism by a youngster from the incident in Boston. So Abhijit Dipke started as just to make fun, mock the CGI Chief Justice and some of the politicians. So he created this satirical political party, and almost mimicking the largest political party, Prime Minister Modi leads, the BJP. So he created this CJP, Cockroach Janta Party, and he floated this party with some manifesto and a few agendas, and none actually imagined that in just matter of 4 days that on Instagram it will have more than 20 million followers. And that actually alarmed even the ruling party, which prompted that account was blocked on national security immediately, because it created a panic actually. And then what exactly and then a lot of people said that okay, this will be more like kind of online movement, and which will remain in the Instagram, on Facebook or on Twitter. It will never actually come to the offline thing. But in just less than 3 weeks, they had their first on offline street protest at Jantar Mantar, New Delhi, just a couple of days back. Although it's not a roaring success, but I think several thousands people turned up to show they are in scorching kind of summer. So that shows that there are a lot of actually anger, frustration, which are actually there on the below the surface, and that was actually looking for some kind of a platform in which people wanted to ventilate, especially the young. And there are clear 4-5 reasons which led to such surge of millions of people supporting this satirical online movement. One of the structural factors I would see is the deep-seated disillusionment of young people about the political system, about the political parties, about the political leaders. They see that these people are actually self-serving. They're not really accountable. They're not really caring about their well-being. And they most of them, if you see, they didn't even reach out to the opposition parties. So it's not about just ruling party, including opposition parties. So there is a kind of disillusionment about entire political class, that they are not really here to serve the society. They are basically to probably here cater to the oligarchs, to the big industrial lobbies, and people who are basically their cronies and their core sort of supporter, or the people who fund them. That's one. Second thing is also about this issue. About it resonated a lot about the education system, the question paper leak, the medical exam paper leak, which actually brought especially millions of young people, because they thought that the government actually is not really able to even create a foolproof system, and almost every, because this sort of question paper leakage happened in 2024. So in a sense, they think that this entire system has been robbed, corrupted from the from inside, and this will not really give them a fair chance to move up in the life. So this was also about bringing accountability in the system. So there was a lot of demand about that governance, the accountability is the least kind of concern of this particular government, whether it's at the central level or at the state level, because these sort of things are happening even at the state level, including opposition run governments. The third thing, I think this also represented, the biggest thing is what actually, you raised that question about gerontocracy. The youth actually protested to a great extent, and a lot of them expressed their anger is that they're not part of this youth. India is one of the youthful, most youthful country in the world, because nearly 377 million people are actually below 25. And with such a younger demographic, if you look at them, being represented in the parliament, in the assembly, or in any decision-making bodies, they're actually absolutely missing. Yeah, I'll just give a figure. Just look at our parliament. Currently, the parliament, there are only less than 3% people actually within the age group of 25 to 35. Only less than 3% MPs are actually Gen Z. And then the second, if you look at number of youngster actually holding any major governance positions, they are nowhere actually. So it's actually, if you look at I'll pull a data, just look at nearly 50% of our parliamentarians, they are at the age group of 60. So if you just look at, it's the youngest country where, nearly 400 million people are actually below 29, and then none of them are actually there. Just 3% of them are as member of parliament. And if you look at minister, cabinet minister of the thing, just you can just count them, one or two of them are there. So in a sense, this also reflected a huge mismatch. And then the fourth thing is also, a lot of people are disillusioned about the inequality, joblessness, because they think that India is one of the fastest growing economy, but ironically, it is also not creating enough jobs for the youngsters. So it might be growing, but inequality, this entire wealth is captured by just 1 to 2% of population. If you look at inequality report, just 1% of Indian hold 40% of the wealth. So a lot of wealth being generated because it's one of the fastest growing economy. But then who gets that? So mostly, it is the patronage network, the oligarchs, the fat oligarchs who actually capture most of the benefits. It doesn't really populate down to the bottom. So what governments actually do, both state government as well as the central government, is basically hand out freebies, welfare goodies, and to just ensure that people survive. They don't really move up in the value chain or the ladder. So that's subsistence living. Doesn't actually show the aspiration of the youth.
Okay, can I just jump in there? So what we're talking about here, what you're talking about protests as opposed to movements that want to form another government. So it's not a democracy reclaim, it's a protest movement that suddenly sprung up. Am I right in that?
I think, yeah, you're right actually. But I think it's a mix of both, reclaiming democracy as well as, also addressing the issues of, livelihood, educational standards.
So they haven't been, but they're not coming up. Sorry, they're not coming up with any mechanism to address those issues. They're just saying they should be addressed. There's a question here that I think is from Margaret Barry. What tactics can youth across South Asia, and you would know this about India, use to overcome obstacles like state surveillance, internet shutdowns, and restrictive social media regulations? Are you getting any of those in India?
Yeah, I think, look at, because when I was coming to that, basically about the digital tech and, the information sphere, because this is what actually has, created this opening for, digital protest or, this CJP thing won't have been possible without, internet, without having, this, internet space. Because number one, while we have most kind of probably fastest growing kind of internet user in India, the digital space is also has a lot of restrictions. You can't actually freely put up something on Facebook or on Twitter or the thing, and then the government agency or the thing will either block it or take away your post, and it's happened very regularly. It's been happening. And then second thing, there are also issues about free speech and other thing, because censorship is also happening for several years. And it's happening both at the central level as well as the state level. So in a sense,
and is there a way around it? Are there VPNs and that sort of thing that people can use, or is it going to restrict it?
Can you please repeat? Actually, I didn't get you.
So the question that came in is what tactics from the youth people make to get around these restrictions?
See, the one thing what people are actually, especially youth have done, I think this Gen Z generation is very smart actually. Like what we have seen in Nepal, like they banned the Facebook and, few other mode, but then they went to the Discord and, they have their other mechanisms in which, they regroup and, they mobilize. So in India, we haven't actually come to that stage where, government can shut down the Facebook or shut down the YouTube or it does what it does is actually selective way. Basically, some of the social media influencer or any particular episode which becomes very viral, those things are taken out actually. So it does actually very selective. So India's actually takes space. The kind of online space is still relatively freer, and people are able to mobilize and do that.
Well, that's a sign of democracy. Thank you very much for that. I want to open up the panel for a final question that's come in from one of our audience here that goes back in a way to what Pradeep Singh said at the beginning on the Arab Spring, because then when, say, the Egyptian government was overthrown and it didn't meet America's interests, we now have a military dictatorship in there. Amit Rama says, which global or regional influences are likely to constrain democratic expansion in South Asia? Pradeep Singh, your quick thoughts, please. Are you with us?
I am. Sorry for that. Just in terms of local, regional influences there is definitely a disconnect between these movements, and it's an important point to note, because so far these movements have not been in conversations with each other, and therefore, even though they have common factors, there's no connection that have been drawn between these movements. While there has also, important to note, there has been a factor of inspiration, not a connection, and therefore to say that there's a regional influence as such, or something that could be bought on as such, would be difficult to say, given that while the factors are common, the local contexts are quite distinct. In some parts of the countries, these are driven by unemployment. On the other parts of the country, if I'm talking about Nepal, it's driven by high interest rates, right? So it's very locally determined, and therefore to say that a regional or a global force to drive sort of, a democratic movement in all of these contexts, I don't think that, having that generalization would be the right vantage point to look at.
Okay, that's very interesting. So Russia, China, America aren't looking on and saying, hey, we want our guy in government there. So Hila Nazneen, the same question as before. Do you share Pradeep's optimism on this?
Why are you always framing it as optimism and pessimism, right?
Well, he's very upbeat on it. But global and region.
He's 23. That's an age to be upbeat. Sorry, Pradeep. I don't mean to put you on the spot. I think what's important to keep in mind is the space that we hold in our imaginations. It's not just how movements unfold on the ground, but what you imagine as an alternative future or possibilities of a different kind of future. And I think all of these movements movements actually gave us that. It's not just the way they organized in terms of the leaderless organizing that we have seen, although, I mean, post-transition, you have seen certain leaders emerge and contest elections and all of that. I'm talking about the Bangladesh context here, and some people getting marginalized. That has also happened. But also capturing the imagery with language, the kind of emotions that are evoked. Those things are very important in the way creativity was used, but also they had learned these tactics from other parts and other movements globally around the world. The exchange that digital medium opens up. And that is very important because a lot of the time, the way the structures seem, it seems like you can't do anything or your agency is very constrained, particularly state surveillance power in South Asia is quite strong, which was one of the questions that was raised, right? I mean, you can find creative ways to bypass controls over digital sphere and all of that, but you're still bypassing. Bangladesh experienced 5 days of internet shutdown. It cost us a huge amount of money. The young people did bypass that, but it also shows state power in terms of locating you, arresting you, harassing you. And there were disappearances in Bangladesh, right? We also had our torture chambers. Let's not forget all of that. But
can I just in the global and regional influences and constraints that come on, in the Western press, when these things open up, you sort of, so-and-so is going to become pro-Islamic or pro-China, or, Mauritius and the Chagos is sort of pro-China. I mean, are you saying that this is not the case, actually?
No, that is absolutely not. But I was getting to, because I want to give both sides, right? So I was connecting to what Prateek said, but I was also going to raise what happened during the uprising, but immediately post-uprising, right? So we experienced a lot of disinformation, misinformation coming from India, particularly Indian bots. I mean, this has been reported by Al Jazeera, BBC, so it's not Bangladeshis just talking about it and all of that. A lot of incidents and pictures being misused, saying minorities being attacked, which I'm not saying that there were not incidents. There were incidents, but in the way it was reported that Bangladesh is going to become an extremist country dominated by Islamist powers. Yes, Jamaat-e-Islami has gained seats than before, but then there are reasons. Historically, Bangladesh elections were contested between the Awami League and the BNP and their alliances, right? And this is a different kind of election where Awami League didn't participate. It was banned from participating, and then the space was different, right? It does not necessarily reflect an Islamist takeover, but that is what was fanned in the Indian media and in the online discourse, right?
Okay. Sorry, we're running out of time. Can I just push this elevate it to Niranjan Sahu? As far as in India goes, Niranjan, is India trying to influence democratic expansion in the region, or is it being influenced itself?
I think India does, because of its size and long history as one of the leader of the democracy, especially the global South. India also always had a kind of what you called sort of effect in the regions, and India has in many ways contributed in strengthening democracy, although it has also influenced, interfered, in many ways, micromanages, from security point of view. So India does play a role, but I think what happened actually in Bangladesh or what happened in Nepal, I think I don't see India played a major role, because these are, I think, what Prateek said, and basically country specific, and they have the unique sort of a trigger for those sort of way. But where I think what I see about India, the current movement, Gen Z movement, which is ongoing, and it is now taking shape in other parts of the country also, because now they are going to also have one in Pune next week, similar like Delhi. What I see is that this is a decentralized, leaderless kind of protest, which is largely, based on digital activism, online kind of things.
Can I
that actually has actually opened also very interesting debate in India, which was not happening for quite, sometimes because of, especially the media.
Sorry, we are right up against time, and I think you've answered that question brilliantly about India's reach and the reach of it, because now is the time to seek the wisdom and the experience of the Democracy Forum chair, Barry Gardiner, who himself has ridden the ups and downs of various democratic surges. Barry, you are not Gen Z, but have we enlightened you at all?
I'm certainly not Gen Z, Humphrey. That's for sure. Yeah, in many ways, I wish I were. It's quite an exciting time. Look, Charles set out the parameters of the debate by talking about the Cockroach Party, and it is an extraordinary feature that they have 1 million people and then 20 million followers on Instagram. That is quite extraordinary. And what it does show, as he said, and as Prahet followed straight through and agreed with, this is about the marginalization of young people. Now, Charles talked about the need to move away from Hindu nationalism, focus on the youth. He talked about what had happened in Sri Lanka, Bangladesh, Nepal, and framed it very much, I thought, as a response to democratic backsliding, a failure to implement promises, and people who'd been in power for quite a long time and wanted to stay there, perhaps by means that were less than democratic. So that was the general background. Now, did we move on from there? I think that's the question. Prahet focused this around Gen Z. He talked about democratic backsliding. He talked about the need to regain democracy, and compared it with the Arab Spring, but spoke about the differences. And in particular, he focused on leaderlessness. And I thought that was an interesting, what is leaderlessness? Is it that we're just now looking at a number of people, all who feel very frustrated and are voicing those frustrations? Or is there the capacity to focus those frustrations into progressive change? And he spoke also about corruption, dissatisfaction with corruption, and these new ways of convening. The digital organization is really profound, but it can, if it is leaderless, begin to see people move off in varying directions without the capacity to amass that sense of frustration into real political dynamism. He spoke also about organization. Now, organization implies that it's organized around a project, around a core, that it's not leaderless. It suggests that there should be an organizer, or at least a group of people who are trying to focus things in a particular direction, not just to coordinate that we all shout and scream at the same time. So he also talked about the role that mediators can have, and I thought it was a very powerful interjection when he said that in Nepal it was the woman Chief Justice who assumed control because she was a non-political figure and somebody who in that sense was felt could be trusted. Now that was reinforced later on, I think, when talking about politicians, and we'll come to that. But he used that phrase, "We have rotating parliaments without change." I think that was almost a direct quote. And if so, Prahet, I will definitely steal it because it's a good quote. And I think it's not just in India or Bangladesh or Sri Lanka or Nepal that we're seeing this. We're seeing this across the world. And I think it does generate the sort of response, certainly from young people, but also I think you can say from right-wing movements like the MAGA movement in the States. They talk about the Uni-Party in the UK, the forces of Farage and Reform. So it is this sense that whoever gets to be in power doesn't bring the change that they promised at an election. And he also addressed economic disenfranchisement that has driven this rather than ideology against repression. Now, Sohila spoke about what things were like in 2024. The focus shifted to Sri Lanka, Bangladesh, Nepal, not just disenfranchisement, she said. She reminded us that in Bangladesh, 1,400 lives had been lost. She also highlighted that the armies, though, refused to go into coup mode. They didn't take over. And she teased out the differences between the three countries, saying, well, who came to power? In Bangladesh, it was the Bangladesh Nationalist Party in a continuation of the previous political ethos, albeit that she said, well, of course, students joined with Jamaat Islamiyah. Sri Lanka, more balanced. Nepal, a new party. And then she said, well, what will they face? They're facing economic crisis. What is the response that these parties are going to make to that economic crisis? And she posed the question of, is systemic change possible? And said, well, look, already in Bangladesh, we see the July Charter being watered down, judicial independence being watered down, and other constitutional bodies being weakened. And in Sri Lanka, she said, she highlighted the failure for women to gain access to power and electoral office. Hope in that their youth, Gen Z, are challenging. And I lost her here when she said, dreaming differently is very important. That was too Jungian for me, I'm afraid. But autocracy seemed immovable in 2024, she said, in Bangladesh. Thinking was that economic reform might manage the situation. But when repression started, the youth it was that forced the ouster. So the historic context in Asia, different to the Arab Spring. We then, of course, learned this wonderful new phrase, gerontocratic political parties. I have to confess that I'm probably now, after 30 years in Parliament, a member of the gerontocratic party. But I still like to think, at any rate, that I understand the frustrations that young people feel, certainly in this country, which are very much, I think, the same that we've been talking about in Southeast Asia. Niranjan Sahu spoke extensively about the Cockroach Party, the extraordinary feat in 4 days, attracting 20 million followers on Instagram, and said shows the underlying frustration with self-serving politicians. And this is the phrase, really. And he spoke about it as not just against the government, but against the entire political class. And I think that's it. Here, what we're seeing is the links that politicians have with money, with oligarchs, with the people who are controlling social media, are really disturbing. And we see the way in which there are companies, say like Palantir, who are developing AI solutions which government are attracted to and want to implement, thinking that it will make governing easier. But there is a price to be paid there, and there's an an uneasy closeness between the politicians and these big new companies, the oil barons of the future. It's no longer going to be oil, it's going to be data. So I think there's a real suspicion here, and something that politicians around the world, not just in Asia, need to think very carefully about. He spoke about youth, 377 million below the age of 30, I think it was, but less than 3% under the age of 35 now have any sort of role in the Indian Parliament. So you can see that sense of underrepresentation borne out in the elections and in the Parliament. Even the economy is growing, even though the economy may be growing, 1% of the population own 40% of the wealth. Well, you're doing very well in that case, because in Britain, 1% of the population own 50% of the wealth. These are extraordinary statistics, and they're statistics which, personally, I wonder whether democracy can survive, because if that is what democracy facilitates, then it's no wonder that young people are extremely frustrated and angry and want to see change. I think I'm out of time, so I'll leave it there.
Barry, thank you. How's the Gen Z representation in the mother of parliaments? We've got some catching up to do.
It's got better from the 2024 intake. It was a much younger intake. I am now being referred to as the veteran Labour MP. I object to that enormously, and I like to correct people by saying, not at all. I am the perennially popular with his constituents MP, having now been re-elected 8 times. So that's the way
we'll have to think up a new word. The venerable, perhaps, would that work?
Bit too like
Barry, thank you very much indeed. I just want to return very briefly to the panel. I just want 1 or 2 words from you to just sum up where this debate has taken us. Reclaiming democracy, South Asia's new surge. Prateep Singh.
I think the key takeaway from this debate is to understand new ways of mobilizing and understand how young people are reimagining democracy in politics.
Young people reimagining democracy in politics. So, Hila Nazneem.
Being radically different about our representative systems, but also how we think about power.
Lovely. Niranjan Sahu.
I think this Gen Z protest with Cockroach Janata Party has opened the real horizon for youth engagement in not only in politics, in the governance, in the economy. I think it is now creating that sort of a debate which was missing for several years. So now they are questioning the media, their sort of responsiveness, why they are only talking about the government. So I think a lot of new things are emerging, and there is a hope.
Thank you very much. There's obviously a big push there going on in South Asia. Thank you all, Prateep Singh, Sohila Nazneem, Niranjan Sahu, for bringing your insight to this debate. Thank you all at the Democracy Forum for making this really important discussion happen. Our next Democracy Forum debate is on June the 30th. Britain looks east, reorientating trade ties. Will that work? Find out then. And until then, from us all at the Democracy Forum, stay safe.
Thank you.
And goodbye.
You are amazing. Thank you.
Thank you.
The Democracy Forum is a not-for-profit organisation founded in 2009 under the patronage of Baroness Nicholson of Winterbourne. Its principal goal was to work for the furtherance of democracy, peace and the rule of law in order to counter religious fundamentalism and intolerance in our global communities. In an increasingly fractured world, This goal continues to be the driving force behind all of the forum's activities. Lord Charles Bruce is the current president of the forum. Since its inception, the forum has hosted and co-hosted seminars on a wide variety of topics relating to democracy and human rights across the world. The Democracy Forum encourages academics, students, journalists, and other socially and politically conscious people to attend our seminars and to participate in the question and answer session. Details are available on our website, thedemocracyforumlimited.com.